So everyone, welcome to the session for the conference. My name is Risha, uh, um, PhD researcher at this department, and finishing my research in 2 weeks. Today we have really great presenters joining us. Me being the only person in person, and also we should have two presenters online. So I Nakaku Thompson, Senior Research Fellow Pathway in Place, Queensland University, and Emmanuel Satu Swatia, MPhil candidate at Kwame Nkrumah University of Technology. But I'm not sure. So I would like you to say hi first, and hi. Can you hear us? All right.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So very unfortunately, today another presenter, Fodor, can't join us because we have some very urgent issues to deal with. And the theme is lived experiences, student community, and promoting inclusion across systems from different student groups in various contexts. And today we have presenters gonna cover race and education, Pacifica perspective from Viola, and me talking about structural inequalities and stratification in China's higher education system, and then passive exclusion of students with vision impairment in STEM from Emmanuel. So just a very kind reminder for our presenters. We have 15 minutes of presentation followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. And because we're still, because Coach is not with us here today, maybe at the end we'll still have about 15 minutes for more questions. And I'm sure if anyone is interested in Coach's research, and I'm sure he'll be very happy for questions and we can find his address from the university. So without further ado, I will invite Viola to give your talk. Is that okay?
Perfect. Oftai lava, talofa lava, maloa lile bula. Warm Pacific greetings to you all. I'm Lamauta Dr. Eva Ngatapu Ponton, you can call me Eva, with ancestral ties to Samoa and Tonga. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land. I pay respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you for being here today. I'm honoured to speak on an issue that is both deeply personal and urgently necessary, navigating whiteness in education from a Pacifica perspective. Let me begin with a simple truth. Education is not neutral. It is built upon ideologies, assumptions, and systems, many of which were designed by and for a dominant culture. For Pacifica students, these systems can feel alien, exclusionary, and overwhelming. Whiteness in education is not just about skin colour. As defined by scholars like Helms and Fegan, whiteness is a complex system, a constellation of ideologies, norms, and behaviours that sets the rules of access, success, and visibility. It's the invisible standard by which all others are measured, and often it renders those outside it invisible. This is particularly true for Pacifica communities in Australia, diverse, culturally rich, and growing rapidly. Yet their visibility in education is often limited to footnotes, if acknowledged at all. Pacifica in Australia, growing force. Between 2011 and 2021, the Pacifica population in Australia grew by over 165,000 people. Despite this growth, there remains little formal recognition of their unique needs, languages, or learning styles in Australian education policy. The term Pacifica itself covers 23 distinct heritages from Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. Each community holds in its own histories, politics, and languages, yet educational systems often treat them as a monolith, or worse, ignore them altogether. The structure of education in Australia is still deeply influenced by colonial practices. It assumes a certain level of cultural capital, familiarity with English as a dominant language, Western learning styles, and access to resources. But many Pasifika families face barriers, unfamiliarity with school systems, lack of information about learning support services, or simply not being represented in the curriculum. These are not failures of the families or the students. These are failures of the system to adapt and reflect the communities it serves.
Sorry,
So what,
do you
yes?
want to interrupt? Do you have slides or
Oh, yes, I thought I was
there are
sharing them.
slides?
Sorry. I do apologize. I thought they were being shared. Can that be seen?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Thank you. Let me just give you a minute to have a look at these. So as I was speaking to before, we usually have a distinct dichotomy or a comparative of the differences between the Pacific core values and those of Western core values, which are often not represented in the curricula that the Pacific communities, the students, any learners or mature age learners are exposed to. So there is an expectation in the Pasifika learners and Pasifika including Māori learners who are expected to know a certain vocabulary, certain ideologies that would make them comfortable in achieving academic assessment success. Some of the ways that we could ensure that academic success is recognised and also represented in curricula is incorporating the Pacific methodologies, otherwise known as Indigenous methodologies. And these are widely utilised and can be used across disciplines. I'm going to present on 3 that have been used across health and education. However, there are a myriad of other Pacific models that are used across from different Pacific Island nations. The first one is Talanoa, which people are actually engaging in, but in terms of acknowledging respectful conversations, it's keeping the dialogue open to ensure that all people are feeling comfortable in the spaces that they are invited in. How often are learners or their families or carers coming into spaces that actually reflect a little bit about their culture? So are there artworks, are there languages, are they bilingual, as it is in AUT, Auckland University of Technology, and many university spaces in New Zealand? Do they have bilingual signs available that recognise not only the Western system in which most of the curricula are written, but also acknowledges the differences that are represented in the classroom? So another Pacific model is Te Leva, and what that means is nurturing the space, nurturing the relationship that are sacred and also present when educators as well as families and their carers come into educational environments. Now, these models work across primary, secondary, as well as tertiary spaces, and I'll use one of the examples moving forward, just how you can adopt many ways of recognising who is sitting within the learning spaces, who is a client or a learner in various spaces like primary, secondary, tertiary, and that way you can recognise and acknowledge the cultural differences in the classroom as well as the cultural nuances that are represented. And one of the wonderful models that have been used in one of our research practices, as well as the way that we engage our community, our communities in Australia. And I just have to acknowledge that my boss, Professor Andrew Harvey, is there, and our program Pathways in Place actually has utilised Whanawhale model, which is holistic approach and having the community leaders, for example, in Village Connect, utilize cultural welcoming, the languages, bilingual early childcare education models within the church structure, and acknowledging that there are spiritual connections that communities that are from Pacific Islands utilize in order to connect and ensure that people feel safe in their educational spaces. So many of our Pacific Island communities do use the Whanawhale model, which uses a holistic approach. You know, it's family, culture, and spiritual beliefs that all align in unison to be able to move forward successfully in any space, whether that's in learning, in sports, in healthcare, and many other disciplines. The impact of these frameworks, they validate the Pasifika identities and enhance engagement. So when one is using, whether it's performing arts, cultural songs, dance, or role-playing storytelling, it actually encourages engagement, whether you are acknowledging as an educator the prior knowledge, the prior languages, and the prior stories and the narratives that the learners come into their educational spaces. There is a win-win situation for all. So reframing education is not just about assimilation, but a transformation of how the curricula can adopt the literature, the writers, and the storytellers from various different Indigenous authors, and that when you do create a methodology or and a curriculum that aligns and works together, that many other learners will be able to feel comfortable and confident in going into tertiary spaces where they are usually first in family to not only successfully complete high school learning, secondary learning to be able to go into these spaces, but they're the first in the generation, like I was, to be able to navigate successfully how to utilize the culturally rich values and beliefs in the Western context. So I believe that when you're marrying the two, where you have programs like the Pasifika Path program at Western Sydney University, and even in our own Pathways in Place at Griffith University, we also have the Māori and Pasifika Pathways to Success, where there are spaces available for people of Pasifika Māori background to go into their rooms, see it decorated as they are accustomed to in their own homes, in their own nations, but also bilingual curriculum available, people who look like them, who are employed to support their educational needs, to be able to talk to and understand their social as well as spiritual needs when they're coming into a space that may lack those values or holistic approaches. So with the goal of keeping within time, and I don't know how quickly I went through that, if there are any questions that you may have in regard to what I've presented, I can provide the chapter that this is based on upon request, and the email will be provided. It usually is in a slide, but I will provide an email. As I said, Professor Andrew Harvey is there, who is available to answer any questions, but I'm going to open this up to question time right now. And also apologise in advance. I do have a group presentation of Australian Pasifika Educators Network straight after this presentation. So thank you. I'd like to open it up to the floor.
Thank you, Eva. And then maybe we will start taking some questions from the room, and then maybe we'll come to if there's some questions from.
Hi there, my name's Amber. I work for a global network of universities called Universitas 21. We have a number of universities in Australia and those Canada and New Zealand who are doing some interesting work around bringing Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum and starting those journeys. But one thing we've talked about as a network is the term Indigenous knowledge or First Nations doesn't necessarily resonate with all the regions that we work in, so Europe, some of the others. but actually we've been thinking a lot about, are there frameworks for more kind of community knowledge embedding and things like that? I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the frameworks that you're kind of trying to put in place in Australia, how we can lift those up a level so that they apply to everyone, even if your country like England doesn't necessarily use like the terminology of Indigenous knowledge or First Nations. Are there things that we can still input to kind of think about how we can make this a broader part of higher education internationally, and what we should be doing to engage with communities?
Thank you for the question. I find that in our research, as well as personal experience and professional experience over the last 20 years, what works is actually discussing and co-creating with the stakeholders that you are talking about what their preferred educational curricula or learning methods as an educator is, and where we've got the Pacific methodology of Talanoa, which is to have the conversation. It's about communication. It's about keeping the lines of communication open and transparent, not just to highlight what the system, what you are delivering, but can you incorporate the needs of those people who are undertaking your particular study? You know, are there, for example, sessions that students can have one-on-one time with? We find that some of these students that are first and family coming into our tertiary spaces, they actually need to be guided, literally sitting next to you and going through at their own pace. And sometimes it may require a bit more time to go through the different vocabulary, the different genres, the different expectations, the academic expectations, which may conflict with, for example, many Pacific Island communities, they have other extracurricular commitments. So what are the commitments that are sort of competing with the expectations that are required of your particular institution? And that's something that we bring into our various initiatives at Griffith Universities and other universities who adopt these support initiatives for the Pacific Island and Māori communities. It's having weekly, so we have MAPS, Māori and Pacifica Pathways to Success. We have mentors and also staff who are available at all our campuses who have an open space available, and our mentors and staff are there with students between 3 to 4 hours after usually after work hours, when most people are available, and also that's in person as well as online. So we're making sure that we have resources available on the ground as well as via email between work hours, of course, and then getting back to responding to their needs where necessary. And usually it is about navigating how do they find their way around campus, how can they learn about referencing using the library tools that are available and so forth.
I'm going to say to that quickly, because I think your question was around the language, right, which is a challenge. One of the challenges in Australia, in this program in particular, so I'm Andrew, is how you talk about Indigenous migrants in a country, right, which is almost a separate term. So we've got First Nations people in Australia, and then we've got Māori and Pacifica, who are Indigenous, but obviously not to Australia. So how do they situate themselves in a First Nations country? And what language do you use for migrants who bring indigeneity with them and that culture that Eve is talking about, but who aren't First Nations in the country that they're doing the work? So it is a global challenge, and obviously everyone's got views around First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders. Even in Australia, all these things are very contested. But beyond the contestation of the language itself is this challenge for peoples who are Indigenous to their own country but have then migrated. How do they position themselves when they've got a culture built around the land, but they're obviously on someone else's land? So these are the challenges that we're trying to work through in the program. And I think, Eva. And then there's our other Pacifica academic in the program have done a great job at helping us to understand that task and working through it with us. And it's an ongoing challenge. But I just think, so there's no easy answer like what's the right term or anything. But it applies even in countries where there's First Nations people, in fact, maybe more so, because that is the primary priority for everybody, including other migrants who bring their own Indigenous cultures with. So just wanted to add that content. Talk more about offline, but I think it's important to situate, as if to situate this work in the Australian context. We're not talking about Samoa. We're not even talking about New Zealand. We're talking about a country where there's an established First Nations people that we work closely with. So in our program, we've got Indigenous First Nations organisations and Māori and Pacifica. We do that very explicitly. So if we just focused on Māori and Pacifica, people would be saying, well, what about us? What about First Nations? So everything has to start with that, whatever the language itself is.
Thanks for the question, also the comment. Eva, are you still have time for one more question from Isaiah?
Sure.
Do you want to come in?
Sure.
Aside from online? Go ahead.
Hello.
Maybe you introduce yourself too.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. This was really interesting. My name's Isaiah, and I'm doing a DPhil in anthropology and education at Oxford. I think I may have misheard or misunderstood the term. Was it Pacifica?
Yes.
Okay. And I suppose just building on the last comments, is Pacifica, could you elaborate a bit more on how someone who's not familiar with that term can, I suppose, read up more about it and understand how it situates itself within, I suppose, an Australian context, but then more broadly how it relates to other contexts? Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Isaiah. So Pacifica is a term where as people living in the diaspora from Pacific nations, it was first adopted in New Zealand in terms of people from Pacific Island nations living in New Zealand from an educational perspective. But as families who migrated twice, say if you're from Samoa and Tonga and so forth, that was adopted then in Australia, that we self-identified as Pacifica. I won't go into what people in New South Wales think compared to Queensland, but it is a general term where as people from Pacific Island ancestry adopt living in the diaspora in Australia. And it's a term that we best identify rather than being called Nesian, as another academic has said, can be Nesian, but for the purpose of our research work, and also our group presentation with Australian Pacifica Educators Network next, we adopt Pacifica as a term that we identify our work under, and as a people who have ancestral ties to the Pacific nations. I hope that answers your question. There is, I'm happy to send out the publication, which has a more detailed blurb about that, and also links onto the report that we've published about Pacifica communities in Australia, and it has that explanation there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eva, for your presentation. It's such a compelling piece of research, and I personally learned a lot from the conceptualizations and reimagining of the higher education space context.
Thank you so much, everyone. And please excuse me, I will watch the recording. I'm going to jump into another presentation. Have a lovely day. Great to see you, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you. And before we move on to the next presentation, which is mine, can we just quickly check with Emmanuel? Are you with us online? On hold. Okay, let's see what happens later. And here. Okay, can you see the slides online too? Okay, that should be fine.
Yeah, thumbs up.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, as I introduced earlier, I finished not yet, my PhD research at this department. And this is a research I did with a group of students based in China, studying at lower tier higher education institutions. And today I will present to you some pieces of findings from my PhD thesis. And of course, I really pleased to get more questions and feedback to help me to reflect back on this journey. So today I'll be sharing with you some background of this research, and one piece of one of the main arguments I'm trying to present in my research was the ordinary self, how students see themselves as an individual in relation to social and institutional hierarchies, and also the way they're perceived by the wider society, and a few takeaways. And I had a few years of working with rural communities before I started this PhD. So I had some knowledge about what rural context looks like, and also the rural-urban divide. And basically, the group of students I work with, they're marginalized rural students. And I had, and one question that has continued to intrigue me and ultimately shaped the core question of this research was, when education is framed as a universal pathway to mobility, what happens to the poor marginalized for whom the path is steeper, narrower? In China, this question sits at the intersection of social justice and our deeply rooted cultural faith in education, the state's vision of urbanization and development, and the lived realities of those navigating inequality in pursuit of a better life. So while there is abundant research on first-generation students accessing higher education, this study offers a distinct lens, as far as I know. There might be a lot of research I haven't really come across. That is, I focus on institutional inequality and stratification, and also the intersection between stratification and our fetishization with meritocracy and elitism, by looking at rural students studying at lower-tier institutions in China. So to elaborate a bit more, much of the existing literature focuses on the top research-intensive universities, examining how academically exceptional students adapt to elite middle-class environments that differ sharply from their original backgrounds. But the reality is, most students from poor or rural backgrounds, they do not attend these kind of institutions. For instance, in the higher education stratification, this is a, I don't know if you can read the text there. So it's, the Chinese higher education system is big. So for the kind of institutions that grant 4-year bachelor's degree, we have, so according to the statistics in 2022, we have like over around 850 institutions. But if you're looking at the larger tertiary or further education system, there's 2,700 of those institutions. But within these 850 institutions, Project 985 and Project 211 universities are deemed as like the top of the top universities. And then double first class universities, 147, they're seen as prestigious universities, or students and families that aspire to get into those universities. So, but these only make up less than 18% of the higher education system. And my study shifts the focus to the majority of the system, the lower tier institutions that receive little media or scholarly attention, to explore a more representative and grounded picture of higher education and student experiences. In light of this reality, I wanted to understand how opportunities, access, participation, and outcome are structured, and how individuals exercise agency as they navigate these conditions. So I look at, not the first year universities, I look at the remaining part of this system. So this is the key question of my thesis, but a lot of my the content I'm presenting today won't really cover all my answers to this question. So influenced by Martinson's series of work on self-formation, I wanted to find out the formation of the self of marginalized rural students when navigating the complexity of structural inequalities, process of marginalization, and the various power dynamics that shape and sustain these systems. This inquiry not only demands a critical understanding of the daily experiences lived by these students, I also wanted to pay attention to how affective and relational experiences with forces of power in return shape or are shaped by the ongoing process of self-formation. Very quickly, to go through the kind of theories that have influenced the way I interpret student narratives and this research process. So Martinson's idea of the theory of self-formation places students at the center of the research and looking at students' agency and reflexivity. And I also use James Scott's theory of everyday forms of resistance, that resistance is shifted from the visible, epic forms of organized movement to everyday resistance that may arise backstage if a closer examination of one's daily thoughts, activities, and exercise could be achieved. And I also use affect theory to understand what is the role of affect in shaping student self-agency and the relationship with power structures. And because meritocracy or neoliberalism are the core of the contextual background I'm dealing with, so I also use Byung-Chul Han's theory of psychopolitics that reframe neoliberalism as a mode of governance whose control has transcended from the bodily to the psyche as insidious, internalized way of governance. There's some other parts of the I also try to deal with the individual society-state relationships, but I won't cover that in my research today. A little bit of the methodology. It is a narrative-based inquiry, and I collected student autobiographies, so they wrote about their life trajectories. And the kind of length is roughly around 4,000 to 6,000 Chinese characters, which is around maybe 6,000 English words. And I also did 2 rounds of sequential interviews with them after I had a preliminary analysis of student biography. So I will start the analysis with stories, which is the core of my research. Pearl Du was a female final year student of humanities at Ocean College when we first met. She grew up in a single parent family in a rural village in the eastern coastal area of China. On a rainy day when she was 12, her father was driving her along the muddy, slippery countryside road when a car suddenly crashed into them. Her father tragically lost his life in the accident, and she was seriously injured and had to be suspended from school for a year. Since then, her family has faced financial difficulties. But through her hard work, interest in learning, resilience, and family support, she became the first person to go to higher education in her family. Who expected her to become a public school teacher. It is a very stable job, and she could make a decent living from it. However, no one in the family had ever been a teacher, so she had to figure out her own way out. Life at Ocean College was peaceful. There was not as much disruption as in her early years. She spent substantial time in her 3rd and 4th year preparing for exams for selecting teachers at regional public school. She lined up in front of the campus library every morning before it opened at 8 and spent her entire day preparing for the exams. In December 2022, she told me about an important exam she was planning to take, but she was very sure that she was only taking it for practice and had no hope of actually getting the job. This reminded me that at one point when we were discussing competition, she mentioned, I feel like I should stay in the middle tier and just make sure that I don't slip below that. She was already booking her return tickets to go home after the region test for the regional selection for public school teachers. But at just this moment, someone from the school texted her, asking her to stay for another day for an interview. She didn't believe it at first and checked multiple times to confirm whether the message could be a scam. Later, she passed the interview and successfully secured a job at one of the regional public schools, a dream job she and her family had aspired to. When reflecting on this process, she emphasized multiple times to me, if there had been more candidates, it definitely wouldn't have been me. She believed that it would have been those who were studying at a better university, one of those maybe prestigious or first-year ones, with better abilities, who seemed more confident, with better family connections. But it would never have been her. She didn't attribute this success much to her hard work, perseverance, and abilities. She said it was luck, 90% luck. Pearl Ju's sense of herself, or more precisely the way she was influenced to see herself, underlines this finding I want to present here. Many students shared a similar way of viewing themselves, like Pearl Ju did. The word 普通, meaning ordinary or common in Chinese, frequently occurred throughout the research process. Out of 37 participants, 24 directly used this word on various occasions related to how they perceive themselves or were perceived by others. 普通 was a word that is often used to associate with their rural identity, their family background, their grades at school, the status of their higher education institution, and the way they perceive themselves in relation to others, and also hierarchies and competitions. For example, I am a Putong person. I was put into a Putong school. I was born in a Putong rural family. I study at a Putong lower tier college. It suggests a sense of being average. Despite ordinary might be a universal state of being, I was really interested in how this meaning of being ordinary might have been shifted because of this huge influence of meritocracy, elitism, and competition. There's also another layer of this meaning, a sense of the self being planned, not as standing out or being remarkable. In Pearl Ju's example, she felt herself being average didn't make her a competent candidate for that exam or the selection process. In the quote shown here of Tranquil Harmony and Purple Reverie, they associate the self of being ordinary with the status or the social perception of the degree. For example, Tranquil Harmony, he like when we talk about the degree, he would say like, I'm always very confused. I don't know how to tell those who have hopes for me that I'm very putong and I might not be able to find a job. So connecting the status or the perception of the degree with the future possibility of securing a job. And Purple Reverie was concerned about, being one of the masses. There's so many people out there who have a university degree, and what's the value of my degree? One interesting aspect of being ordinary is its paradoxical nature, the relative privilege. In other words, the coexistence of privilege and marginality. It is worth noting that the sense of being ordinary requires significant efforts, resources, commitment, and a chance of these students from marginalized backgrounds. Their degree has earned them and their families respect in their communities, where a degree remains highly valued and relatively rare. Yet, there lies a profound structure behind such seemingly uplifting privilege for the poor that cannot be celebrated too soon. And this aspect, although it brings pride and also to the family, this aspect is also often coupled with complexity. When commenting on the universal commenting on the university experiences, Ruby Elegance and Floating Petals shared how studying at lower tier institutions created a sense of dilemma. This perceived sense of being ordinary, as Ruby Elegance puts it, neither here nor there, is not good enough to excel, but not bad enough to fail. Or the status of the degree, in the words of Floating Petals, it is too ubiquitous to hold significant value. That's why Floating Petals, she wants to pursue a postgraduate degree so that she could stand out among the masses who already have an undergraduate degree. The sense of being ordinary is often linked to their ongoing self-positioning reflexive realization of the relative status in the social or institutional hierarchies. And also competitions and meritocracy and elitism always come into play, and they position themselves according to, they often position themselves according to this kind of social discourses around meritocracy and competition. These students could neither place too much value on their lower tier degree nor completely dismiss it. The coexistence of privilege and marginality has created ambivalences and paradoxes for these educated rural youth. Behind this ordinary self, we can see how concepts like competition, hierarchies, meritocracy, and credentialism have shaped the way these students perceive themselves and the society that and how they're perceived too. So after this very brief presentation of one of the main findings from my research, I have just a few takeaways. First is this thesis is neither focuses on the stories of the elites, the privileged, the bourgeois narratives at the top of the hierarchy, nor on the often celebrated tales of life changed through higher education, nor does it endorse the neoliberal and meritocratic ideologies. Instead, it explored the formative journeys of marginalized students with relative privilege. The ordinary pursue higher education to seek a better life. Student stories showcase how neoliberal and meritocratic norms have often failed to materialize their promises and change circumstances for the marginalized, and the social political changes in the meaning of being ordinary. The inquiry into the uneven and stratified student formation experiences also contests a universal understanding of higher education. Many massified higher education systems, including the one that I have examined today, are characterized by a fetishization of merit, the elitism, and a social Darwinist form of competition, which disguises a proliferation of structural inequalities and dilemmas. And I also explained that universally acknowledged assumption that higher education always enables, empowers, and transforms individuals is contagious. Reviewed through the students' formation of the ordinary, such returns are often conditional, structural, and paradoxical. And that's the end of my presentation, and thanks for listening. I guess we'll see if there's any questions from the room and if there's any more questions from online.
So I just wanted to ask, my name is Osancho Aksaki and I come from Youth Futures Foundation. I just wanted to know, did you look into other poorer youths who face other barriers such as like criminal justice system, care leavers and mental health? If not, if so, how does this compare to your findings, or what would you expect to see?
Thank you for this question. So in my thesis, I also touched a little bit upon gender and ethnicity, because those are some of the main factors influencing student access and participation, but probably not like caregivers, because in China, if you know, the system is very linear. So people expect you to follow one trajectory and you don't take, let's say, deviations, or you start a family and then come back. You don't normally see that in our context. So I think gender plays a really important role in shaping student aspirations for higher education. For example, one of the participants, actually not just one, a few of them, I noticed that they, for them, higher education was one of the very limited ways for them to get out of the kind of discrimination or social injustice in their own context. For example, one participant mentioned, if I don't continue my education and go into higher education, I would end up marrying very young. So I think this is the way that why she is very committed to her journey, although, you know, this trajectory hasn't been very smooth for her, but she always had this very strong belief that she has to take this path and she has to succeed, because that's probably one of the only few opportunities for her to go to a different space where she could be opened up. There will be more opportunities open for her. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you very much. I did enjoy the presentation, and also the infusion of Murchison's argument of higher education as self-formation, which was evident, I think, in the participants' voices. So I'm just interested, like most of the narrative which you presented, I think to me, yes, the participants had achieved something, but the manner in which it was presented as if maybe there's no any other hope, like no the one who got a teaching job, for instance. Yes, it is true that they believed it was like even if they had a university degree. So my question then would be, how do then elite universities, for instance, get students from the context of the universities which you went to? Are there chances that a student would go through the institutions you visited for your research and then go to universities such as the Beijing universities or Shanghai, the top tier Chinese universities? Are there opportunities for such transition? Because education, it is about self-formation, and it also gives them hope for those who acquire this qualification.
Thank you for your question. So there's another parts of my thesis that I talk about the kind of aspirations they have for what's after the undergraduate. So these days in China, it's surprisingly not surprising. I think one of the main things that is this trend that I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of them, they want to pursue a postgraduate degree. So among 37 of my participants, maybe there's around 60% of them, they express this motivation or desire to pursue a postgraduate degree at some point of their university life. I find this is really interesting because they feel like I think some of the quotes also mentioned, they don't feel having an undergraduate degree is enough. That's why they want to continue this journey to accumulate more social or cultural capital to prove that they are more competitive or competent when they come across, let's say, job seeking. And then, so that's the way that they would have chances to go to those, let's say, more prestigious universities in China. But there's also one thing that we need to be aware. I also address a lot of discrimination against students coming from lower tier institutions. So a lot of these students, they told me, and also it's kind of like a lot of people, they talk about this on online forums and student self-organized online forums. They identify the kind of institutions that discriminate students like them. So to kind of alert everyone, don't apply to these universities, because, for example, there are 2 rounds of selection. First is like the standard test, and everyone does the same test, and second round is interview, where manipulation and discrimination can easily happen. So they complained about a lot of them, they could be likely to be marked down because they come from a less prestigious background. So I think this is tricky. And what I'm trying also to argue in my thesis is, it seems like a endless process. If we create this imagination of our life as, okay, we should go to those prestigious and elite institutions, there's always people who can't really end up in there. I think this is the way we really need to think about, what shapes our imaginations about higher education, what is higher education for, and how stratifications and hierarchies, they really create dilemmas and frustration, and also constrain our way of thinking of ourselves, and also the purpose of higher education. I think it was their hand. Do you mind if we maybe move on to the next presenter, and maybe we come back at the end of the session? Okay. So Emmanuel, are you with us now? Hello, you're on mute. Hello, Iman, can you hear us? Hmm.
He has a network problem.
Yeah, but he said that his network seems fine now.
Okay.
Hello, Emmanuel, can you hear us? Okay, it's tricky. Let me just type a message. Okay, I guess he's or her is not with us now. Should we take just very quickly more questions and then
Thanks very much for the very interesting work. I want to ask a question about this category of ordinary, because it would seem that this is a relative category, because in terms of their family and rural backgrounds, they presumably are not ordinary, because most people in those situations do not go to higher education. But when they get into these institutions, then they become ordinary. So there's something about what the discourses around higher education are doing to shape their formation in that way. And then, of course, being ordinary becomes relative not to where they've come from, but relative to a stratified higher education system. But it doesn't seem to be a completely fixed category either, because if it were, presumably they would not be aspiring to higher education. So I think it's a really kind of interesting, but it's not a fixed category. There's still a fluidity around it. But I think it's really nice work. Really interesting.
Thank you. There's another chapter of my work that I think I already presented on the findings of the seminar is to disrupt and stabilize the concept of being ordinary.
Yeah.
Like how students they change their ideas of, am I ordinary and in relation to what? And they constantly systems of evaluation or assessment. So maybe, for example, how do they deal with their region, like where they're actually the educated elite youth from their own background, and then how do they deal with institutional assessment? If I'm being a top student in my class, in my major, and then putting themselves in the wider competition among all these undergraduates or graduates in China. So there's different layers of competition and relational prestige or feeling of being ordinary. So it's very complex, and they struggle and then also negotiate and also trying to find out where is the better way to position myself and how can I not be too bothered by this discrimination.
Just building on that, I just wondered if you had any reflections. I guess the UK's similarly quite a pluralistic higher education system, and I work for a regulator. That's my interest. I work for the Office for Students, and we regulate English universities and providers. But I think universities play a very active role in shaping their conceptualization of themselves as kind of teaching intensive or research intensive or both. And I'm wondering if it's similar in the Chinese system and how kind of the discourse that the universities feed into might shape how students see themselves as ordinary or exceptional, or kind of in an institution for their undergraduate degree that does one set of things before they move to a different kind of institution at postgraduate.
That's a really interesting question, and I also maybe in the future, if I have opportunity, like to do like a survey of systems, context, and how the categorization of institutions. So I think for these kind of institutions I work with, it's a little bit tricky because I think, for example, the macro level of agenda development, I think the state tends to focus more on those top universities because they're considered as the drivers of innovation, development, and economic growth. But for those, I think they're in a tricky position and also vague space of, where do they find their purpose? Is it teaching? Teaching is a little bit not the really priority. Is it research? Probably they don't have that many resources. And is it more like professional engagement? I think that's where these universities, they try to engage more. So their students, the universities I work with, they start to build, for example, labs and workspaces for the students to develop more practical skills. But there's also another interesting fact is, so there's also this very interesting tension and power dynamics between the students and the institution. And another story I mentioned in my thesis was one of the participants. She was put into put in touch with a private education company, and which turned out to be predatory to how to say it, to intrigue her to participate in a course called How to Transform Yourself. And then she didn't go because she later find out, or maybe it's not really not reliable. And so the interesting thing is the university was liaised with this company and provide access for them to talk to the students. So it's a lot of power dynamics going on, and you don't really know what do these universities want for their students, and are they really become the gatekeepers to protect the students, to create a really supportive environment for them? I think it's something that's really worth looking at, and yes. So going back to the question is, I think providing a supportive and also nurturing environment for them to grow and learn is really important, and also at least to become a more responsible gatekeeper for what is good for the students. So if we don't have any more questions or comments, I think we're also happy to close earlier. And sorry for we don't get to hear about Emmanuel and also Kojo's presentations, but I'm sure if you're interested, feel free to contact them and they will provide you with more information about the research.